Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Earl Johnston from Hypatia Industries.
Patrick Harrington from Mildly Geeky in Boston.
Marin Nulevent, freelancing in Portland, Oregon.
And today we have on as our guest John Allsopp, a veteran of the web development industry and one of the founders of the Web Directions Conference. John, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
And you're joining us from, you're one of those future people, right? You're joining us from Australia?
That's right. It's tomorrow morning down here in Sydney.
So we wanted to talk to you because you have a super interesting perspective. You have been around the web before the web was really a thing. Like, what was it kind of like back in the day when you got going?
So, funnily enough, I was building something that I was building a hypertext system in the early 90s. I actually was very interested in hypertexts.
So you could have been the one that made the web if that hypertext thing caught on.
Well, that's right. Although I kind of, and interestingly at the time, and I've written about this quite a bit, so what people don't know is that in 1991, there was a big conference series called Hypertext, because they knew how to name things back then. And Hypertext was really a hot thing at the time.
Yeah, you remember Xanadu? Do you remember Project Xanadu?
Right, absolutely. Ted Nelson goes back to the late 60s. But by the late 80s and early 90s, you had a bunch of products from every major software vendor that utilized ideas of linking and so on. And there's a whole field of research that went back a quarter of a century that uses the term hypertext. So Tim Berners-Lee proposed a paper for that hypertext conference in 1991, and what people don't know, it was rejected.
Oh my God!
So seriously, like the whole field of they allowed him to do a poster and a demo, but he couldn't present on it, right? And it's actually I've written quite a lot about it, and I think it's really instructive, and it continues to be very valuable. The lessons we can learn from what happened there is because hypertext had a set of practices and ideas and concepts around it that were considered bedrock, that in order for it to be complex, rich hypertext, it needed to do a bunch of things.
Right.
And the web did none of those. It was decentralized. The links were one-directional. Like if I linked to a document, the document didn't know I was linking to it.
Right, yeah, and that was a big foundation of all those hypertext systems. I remember reading up on Project Xanadu, yeah.
So one of the core ideas of Xanadu, and actually a deeper idea was around intellectual property. Like, so one of the core ideas of Xanadu is the concept of transclusion, which is a bit like an iframe, really. But the idea of transclusion was when you linked to and incorporated something from another document in an existing document, you actually weren't copying in. You essentially were including or transcluding the actual document itself.
Yeah, it was a reference, so that if the original document changed, so would the thing that included it. Yeah.
Right. So you can think of them a bit like iframes, right? Well, we kind of got there, but no one thinks of iframes as a kind of transclusion. And the reason why why it was very important to him to have transclusion was to basically allow for intellectual property to be maintained, for people to be paid for their authorship and so on. So there were a whole bunch of things that the web just didn't do. And so I was building a desktop hypertext system for the Mac. And it came from my background. I studied law and a bunch of other things.
Was this before or after HyperCard that you were working on this?
So this was sort of, I guess, inspired in part by HyperCard, and I prototyped using HyperCard, and then I moved to building it as
John, I realized how old I was recently when I was talking to some other people in the tech business, and I was likening something to HyperCard, and they looked at me and they said, "What's that?" Like they had no idea what it was.
I know about like 15%.
And yet, in some ways, I think that was a pivotal piece of technology that inspired a great many people.
Right.
It's a great many ideas. Like its scripting language is probably kind of inspired, just about every scripting language subsequent to it, and I feel like it has its influences on even JavaScript. So
yeah, HyperScript was one of the coolest things about HyperCard. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you could kind of build rich content without necessarily having to program, but then you could add interactivity and deeper interaction using a scripting language. And I think it kind of inspired a lot of early web designers and developers. So if you go back to the time when the web first emerged, it was among many systems and considered, if at all, to be inferior to many systems.
So why did it win? What happened? Why did it win?
That's it. Well, and I wrote, I've written extensively over the last 25 years, and one of the ideas I keep coming back to is where things that we often consider to be bugs are actually really features. So you just have to think about, is the simplicity of the web a bug, which at the time we thought it was, or was it a feature? And I think it was a feature. So I think there were a couple of key factors, right? So one was you could become you could know everything about web development in half a day,
right?
You didn't have to be a programmer. You didn't have to know any programming languages, right? You didn't even have, you could simply this simple idea of marking up a document, which most people at the time who were in any way technically literate were kind of doing. That's what word processing kind of looked like,
right?
Like certainly in the age of DOS. And so for the most part, we'll see Windows 3.1. Maybe it'd come out as a simultaneous, so for the most part, unless you're a Mac user, you're a DOS user. So if you used a word processor, you were basically writing little macros and little markup in your document to say
or Unix and nroff and troff.
Right, exactly. So but they were the most technical people. But even any computer user would have been very comfortable with the core ideas that the web embodied of kind of marking up content and so on. And so I think it's simplicity.
Right.
Was one thing. I think
how accessible it was to people. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think it got its timing right. So if you think about what happened in the 1980s, is we basically created a generation of digital creators. So you had the emergence of things like PageMaker and WYSIWYG.
Oh yeah, Aldous PageMaker.
Of content. Right. You had the emergence of things like Photoshop and similar bitmap tools and early primitive vector tools. Even a video and audio editing. So what you did was you sort of suddenly were priming the pump, with a bunch of folks who could create content for this new platform. So imagine the web emerges in the mid 80s because the technology was there and the internet was there.
Right.
Pretty primitive, but not much less primitive than it was in 1991, 92, right? A lot of the technology was there. But what wasn't there was a bunch of digital creators who could suddenly see this platform as a distribution platform for their content.
Right.
And I think that was the other thing, that the web was envisaged as a way, as it's almost a cliche, but for sharing scientific knowledge, it was not.
I mean, let me tell you, back in the day, back when the web was like kind of emerging, I had a forum on America Online. Like that's my company had a forum there, and that was kind of like the digital hub. I know it sounds really quaint these days, and actually a lot of people probably don't even know what the hell America Online is. But there was a time that just not enough people were on the web. There wasn't really a critical mass. But it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing the way that it exploded. And you think that is attributed in large part to how accessible it was to the content creators?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that firstly, those content creators existed, right?
Right.
They were there. Right? I think the kind of the late 80s digital explosion of digital creativity, which often ended up on paper. Like there was a lot of people don't know. There was a real transformation in the magazine industry in the late 1980s with desktop publishing. So instead of just having a relatively small number of really top-end publications, a lot of which still exist, the Cosmopolitans,
right,
and the GQs and those sorts of kind of top-end, the New Yorker, you suddenly had an explosion because the cost of production, distribution, printing of specialized magazines, exploded, right?
I remember back in the day, my uncle was a printer, and he was around during that kind of transition to desktop publishing. And in fact, my father was kind of in the corporate marketing and communications business, and he actually called me to come in to help him figure out these funky new computers because they were starting to use like PageMaker and Quark Express and that kind of thing. But my uncle, who was a printer, like they got decimated for a while because people were able to produce a lot of this stuff a lot cheaper and a lot quicker with the desktop publishing stuff,
Absolutely. So, the whole bunch of interesting things happened, but I think one of the things that we have to keep coming back to is I feel that it was really content, which is what's driven the web, right? And content creators and digital creators.
That makes sense.
And they were there, they existed. And I think the other thing was the business of it all. One of the criticisms of the web was that, which is ironic, but this was a relatively rare concept at the time, is it was free. Right? Free to use, there were no licensing fees, there were no licensing restrictions. But Tim Berners-Lee and Robert Cailliau, who was kind of his boss at CERN, who I've had the privilege to meet a few years back and talk with about this, they pushed really hard within CERN to basically make it public domain.
Right.
It took the months to do that. Right?
And that's probably a big key as well. Yeah, it wasn't a walled garden.
And there wasn't a walled garden, and something very interesting happened at the same time that indicates there was the probably may well have been the case. So there was a competing technology called Gopher,
right?
Which nodding in agreement. The old folks,
yeah, but a lot of people listening are like, "What the hell is he talking about?" They don't even know what that is.
So Gopher. So it came from that. I believe the University of Minnesota, which I believe the Gopher is the mascot of the school. And Gopher was not dissimilar, probably in some ways easier to use platform to the web, to the early World Wide Web. It even had things like images where at the time before the web hit, right? But what they did faithfully, the regents of the University of Minnesota in about 1993, they made a very fateful choice that some people will argue helped the web to win. Because Gopher had probably a bigger user base. And what a lot of people probably don't know is the early Netscape versions were also Gopher clients, right? Like you go to web content, but they were also newsreader clients, and they were Gopher clients, right? So you just go to the Gopher protocol, Gopher://.
Well, tell people what Gopher is. Like, what would it let you do for people that have never heard of it before?
Yeah, look, it was in some ways a simplified version of the web where you could just incorporate text, but it also allowed you to incorporate images. You could link. So in many ways, it was a very similar competing technology to the web. But what the regents of the University of Minnesota decided was that you couldn't. You basically had to pay a license fee to run a server. So suddenly, to run the clients, you didn't have to pay, but to run a server, you did. And we ended up with this. I believe that really gave the web an enormous boost because suddenly, if you wanted to run a web server or write a web server or anything, there was no intellectual property challenges, no cost.
Right.
And it was right at the time, I guess, where open source was becoming something of a thing. And, it could well be that we will be Gopher developers now.
Right. But I think you make a really good point that probably the barrier of entry and the fact that this stuff was free just made it super easy for people to get online. And, I know my background is in software engineering. And yours is as well. And back in the day, when I was working on Mac apps and that kind of stuff written in C or, whatever it ended up being written in, we kind of looked at the web as not really actual programming. Like people that are doing that stuff, they're not actually really developers,
I think that's been an attitude ever since. I think it probably continues in many respects to be an attitude today about the web, right? I think it's one of the challenges of how it's treated by universities. The languages, aren't treated with respect in a lot of ways, or they're considered vocational. They're not considered, and as a consequence, I think this leads to some challenges around how we produce developers and the nature of developers entering into the industry.
But did you kind of have a similar view back then? In terms of you came from a quote unquote real development background. Wow, is someone doing construction at your house?
Yeah, they are. Is it terrible? It's like,
it sounds like a kid is taking a balloon and just kind of squeezing the air out of it slowly and annoyingly. You know what I mean?
I do. I'm hearing it here. These are terrace houses where my office is, and it's in the literally adjacent terrace. So we share a common wall.
Whatever. We're just going to ignore it and keep going. If you want to hear the gold, you're going to have to suffer through it.
That's it. Then we are, so you'll have to too.
But did you have kind of a similar view, coming from a traditional programming background, that the web was kind of like a playground or, play toys, that kind of thing?
Interestingly not. Obviously, this is my memory shaped by 25 years subsequent. I genuinely felt that the web was an underpowered technology that would be replaced by something that embodied that set of fundamental principles and characteristics that we all thought hypertext had to have.
Right.
But as a platform, I guess in many respects, I was also very interested in publishing and content, right? So while I was a software engineer, I was building systems to help people publish and manage content, mostly written and visual content. So to me, and at the time, I don't think anyone really saw it in any way as a development platform, right? It was
I agree.
Content markup and distribution platform.
And I don't know about in Australia, but here it was actually really hard. I think one of the things that really made the web kind of take off is when money started being exchanged online. And I remember in order to actually apply for and get a merchant account, which is what you needed to process this stuff, was really, really difficult because the banks didn't know what these online transactions were, and they were scared of it. Like they did not want to give out a merchant account to people that sold stuff online, which may sound insane today when you look at Amazon and you think about the billions of dollars that is exchanged online. But back in the day, the banks were very reticent to give out a merchant account for anyone that sold anything online. Is it similar in Australia?
I think. Oh, look, if anything, we lagged way behind. I wouldn't really say that there was a professional industry of any real substance here until well into the 2000s. I remember we went to this conference in 2004, and I remember, so we skipped forward a bit more than a decade now, but and it really was a decade before, I think, that for the most part, there were very many, if any, people really running, there was much of an industry. I think a lot of people, it was a side gig they were doing as part of what other things they were doing. And I remember at our very first conference, one of the founders of Campaign Monitor, which many people are probably familiar with now, a tremendous success story.
Sure.
Sure.
He was there. He must have been very young at the time, and talked about, and I've known them ever since, and talked about how they were so excited that this, at the time they were running a little agency, and a lot of what they did was they were doing email campaigns for their clients, and that's where Campaign Monitor ultimately came from. So when he was like, this is so exciting, and it's great to see so many people, and we had a couple hundred people there, and then he said, we're hiring someone, and we're really looking, and I thought, wow, this is amazing, people are actually here, and they're actually hiring people, because I'd been through more than a decade, where you just, if you wanted to have a way of being professionally in the industry, it was like you were hustling for gigs here and bits there, and it took a very long time to transition.
Yeah, for us, the website was like an afterthought. It was like, I guess we'll make this thing just to kind of have it. And it's amazing, these days there are entire businesses that the entire business is the website, which is quite a change. Oh,
absolutely. So, but to your point of whether or not, how people felt about the set of technologies, whether they were kind of, toys, I think that persisted and probably persists still. I mean, I wrote an essay some years ago now, but it was one of those ones heavily trafficked, and it was also, highly commented on, relatively speaking. And it was all like,
oh God,
it just,
lots of comments on the internet is never good.
Yeah, right. Well, and the ones that are going to get comments, right?
Right.
You always know, and the comments. There's obviously, there seems to be inverse proportionality between the quality of the comments and then the quantity of the comments. But this was I kind of had enough about people saying, the web is not real programming, and it was addressing particularly HTML and CSS, right? And talking about how these are complex, sophisticated technologies with enormous reach that will be around for generations, and we treat them as being trivial at our peril, and in fact, if we're not producing great content using these technologies, that's a huge mistake. And the number of people who had to weigh in about whether CSS was Turing complete, therefore it was real programming, this is so boring, right?
Right.
But I think that persists. I think that we perhaps to some extent, as a collective industry, certainly maybe older folks do bristle a little at that kind of whole issue.
See, the interesting thing,
the respect was a long time coming.
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing to me is that, you were mentioning earlier that part of one of the reasons you thought the web became the technology that was the standout. And a lot of people don't realize that there were a lot of competing technologies that could have been the standout. But you mentioned that one of the reasons you thought the web became the technology that we're using now is how accessible it was for people to go ahead and create stuff. Because it is true that a designer that learned a little bit of HTML and a little bit of CSS could produce something, could produce a whole website, But that has changed quite a bit these days, I think, where it's pretty, like, you need to be pretty technical to make a modern website. And do you think that is a problem? In other words, what was the web's strength in terms of how accessible it was for people to create stuff? Do you think the fact that it has become more technical is raising that barrier? And do you think that could be a problem?
Yeah, look, I think it is. Although, when you see the rise of whether it's WordPress or hosted platforms like, Wix and so on, which, there are things you could be negative about in some of these things, but I think perhaps they're replacing the original build your own sort of approach that those early adopters had. So I don't think there's necessarily, I think there are avenues and mechanisms by which people can find audiences. And in part, the question sort of is, are the likes of Instagram and other platforms, for better and for worse, becoming the place in which those creative folks find their audience? I think that's what Medium in part is trying to do with written content. I think text has its own particular challenges. But in terms of, like visual activity, the likes of Instagram, and so one of the, I wonder whether we need to be looking in other places to find those kind of early instincts in the early web where like those really early adopters were trying to find a place for expressing and distributing their thoughts, away from more traditional channels which were very restrictive. There's an irony in part that we're now recreating a whole bunch of siloed platforms.
But is it becoming too fragmented? Like if sites like Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, is where people are really spending the majority of their time, is that kind of analogous to the media conglomerates? And is it becoming too many little islands where the traffic and the content is concentrated?
Yeah, look, I think there are many old timers, and I include myself in that, and maybe not just old timers, but there are many of us who, would express that concern. I think one of the great promises of the web was that democratization,
right?
And part of that was its distributed nature. And I think we're seeing some real risks, and it's very interesting that. So I think opposite to this is perhaps what's happening right now at Facebook, where Facebook for quite some time have really worked very hard with traditional publishers, and traditional publishers have worked very hard with Facebook to fill your stream of content with a bunch of stuff from those publishers, and for those publishers to be able to monetize those, as the attention seems to have moved increasingly toward a small number of those siloed platforms like Facebook. But literally, it seems in a matter of weeks, Facebook has decided, for all kinds of reasons, that they don't really feel there's a long-term value in them for those relationships. And so, a whole bunch of publications, some of which have emerged essentially to take advantage of Facebook as a platform, with BuzzFeed and Vox and Vice and all, I know Vice has been around a long time, but like a whole bunch that really either emerged around Facebook to take advantage of Facebook as a distribution mechanism, or have really started to rely heavily on Facebook, I think will face some very significant challenges, right? I.e., go to the wall,
right?
And so perhaps we will, need to relearn that lesson, and ultimately, maybe we just have these endless cycles of kind of aggregation and disaggregation, right? So we've sort of even seen that the last 20 years or so with the web, and maybe that's the cycles that we see. We'll see an aggregation toward Facebook, an over-reliance on it, a monocultural business models, and then some sort of famine, which will essentially wipe out the businesses that are hyper-reliant on Facebook. And in the wake of that, I think people's desire for content and creativity, like things to consume, to read, to watch, to listen to, that doesn't go away, right? I just think, so that attention will be sitting there waiting. And I feel like that's probably what we're going to see.
Yeah. And I think you made a really good point earlier that a lot of the content creators who might have been able to build the site themselves, they're now using tools like Wix or Webflow, or some companies, like, they don't even have a website. They've got like a Facebook page. And if you want anything...
And they go to iTunes, right? They put their podcast on iTunes and they put their videos on Vimeo.
That's it.
YouTube. And,
That's
there's
it.
a whole, and to me, there's some really interesting. So we're moving away from the core technologies to essentially what the technologies enable, which, to be quite honest, is what drew me to the web in the first place.
Right.
And even as a software engineer, my concern, my interest of, like, while I have always loved writing software, what I've been always interested in is what are the impacts of the software we write. Like, we talk about a tech industry. I had this conversation with a brilliant, long-standing designer yesterday. I had lunch with. And we talk about this tech industry, but there's not really a tech industry like anymore. Like there was for a while. I think more tech just is permeating everything.
Yeah, tech is everywhere.
Enabled by tech, right?
It's in your refrigerator.
We don't talk about the electricity industry, right? Like, I mean, there is an industry that creates electricity, but what's really interesting about electricity is what changes when you electrify it, or what is enabled when you electrify it. And I think that's where we're moving toward.
And not just that, John. Oh my God, what happens when we don't have electricity? It's kind of like if you lose your internet, you're like, oh my God, like my life is totally different.
Right. Exactly. And then maybe as we move up the pyramid, we ask ourselves, what happens when we decide to take a break from the internet or the web, all those technologies? Because I think, I as a parent and as a person who's been involved in this industry for a long time, and I have concerns about whether or not the permeation and the extent to which the technologies and the things that we build on top of the platform are part of our life, right? Literally 24 hours a day.
No, I totally
always entirely healthy, right?
I totally get what you're saying, because I remember I spent about 3 weeks on a liveaboard boat in the middle of nowhere, where prior to going down there, I was hyper interested in news. I was reading the news articles every day and all that kind of stuff. And while I was away on that boat, I couldn't do any of that. And I felt like I was missing like so much. Like I thought like the world was ending. And then when I got back and I looked at what was going on, like I was like, nothing really happened. Like, there were tons of headlines and there's tons of alarmist crap, everywhere. But really nothing happened while I spent those 3 weeks away from all of this information and news. And that was kind of a revelation for me. And I actually stopped being so interested in reading news after that. I kind of toned it down from there. But one of the things that I wanted to circle back to was you mentioning that a lot of people may be building content using some kind of a content creation tool, whether it's Wix or Webflow or Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is. The interesting thing to me is that I think what that means is that if you're a designer, you're still going to have somewhat of a job, because someone still has to design this thing and kind of make it look good, although, they are providing people with building blocks that look pretty damn good when you snap them together. But there's this kind of like mid-range developer that I think that their job is just going to disappear, because if what you're skilled at is building HTML and building CSS, maybe a little JavaScript, and you do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, I think the type of things that you would work on are going to disappear, because they're going to go to one of these platforms, and you may be the one using that tool perhaps. But it really seems to me like the areas where there's going to be real work are going to be the more technical areas, where, people that are building Facebook or people that are building these platforms that other people are using to build stuff. And do you have any thoughts on that? If you think that, like, my personal point of view is that the low end of web development is just going to get lopped off, because these services are just going to gobble it up.
And look, I think your instinct is 100% right. I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing or even the right thing.
Right.
But we've noticed, so one thing we've noticed, we run these events people may not know, for the web and digital industries. And we from quite sophisticated, deep JavaScripts and performance and security, all the way through to like interaction design, user experience design, right? So because we emerged around the web where kind of pretty much wore every one of those hats, and so but over time we've kind of specialized individual conferences around each of those areas, or multi-track conferences that there's an engineering track and a design track. And what we've definitely seen over the last 2 years is a movement, a very serious kind of movement toward one or other of those camps.
Right.
People sit in one or the other. So we for a number of years ran a conference called Respond, which obviously kind of around web design, responsive web design, and really a lot of it was about, at the time when we're really starting to grapple with the challenges of multi-screen worlds and how we design and develop, and that was a real challenge. Like, how do we design and develop for the tablet and the phone and the laptop and the desk, all those challenges. And what we found over the last 18 months is firstly we kind of moved a lot of that content more toward the kind of capital D design. Probably around 30 to 50% HTML, CSS. Really always kept the JavaScript kind of stuff out of that. That sat in our engineering conferences. And what we found is increasingly, and then we've done some research around this in all sorts of ways, that very few people simply write HTML and CSS anymore, particularly in the kind of professional setting, right?
Right.
And increasingly, they're saying maybe nice to have, maybe, right? And there's, but really where the core of people's skills, who's being hired for, either really gravitates toward JavaScript with a bit of that on top, or moving toward very much design roles. And I think that that gap in the middle, like whether we want to see this gap, that role in the middle that you described, kind of your strengths are HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript, and those roles I'm certainly seeing kind of vanish. And then when
and that's the irony. That's the irony, John, is that if you were a designer or a user experience person who never invested a whole lot of time in getting like super good at HTML or CSS, like your job is probably still really secure because people still need really good design, and that's not something that can be automated via computer. But if you were one of those guys kind of in the middle that kind of was a jack of all trades, doing a little HTML, a little CSS, tiny bit of JavaScript, like I really think that the floor is going to fall out, and it's going to fall out soon.
Yeah, look, I do share that instinct, and so now if you're one of those people, like I understand how that feels.
Right.
I was a Mac developer in the 90s, right?
Me too, man. I had did you have the phone book, the inside Mac phone book?
Absolutely.
I still got one.
And
I still got it.
I think I might have one of them somewhere, and then the CD-ROMs, and that's what our world felt like.
Right.
I guess we kind of lived in denial, and the Mac was, and then of course the Mac did make a comeback.
Yeah, people don't know this, John. I don't mean to interrupt you, but a lot of people, believe it or not, a lot of people that are around don't realize that as a Mac developer, I had a day where I sat there and I'm like, oh shit, I better look for something else to do, because Apple really was like about to end, which may seem crazy.
Of what?
Yeah, it may seem crazy because it's the world's most valuable company now, but I'm telling you, there were some moments that I was sitting in my office and I'm going, oh shit, like I really need to figure out something else to do because this is done.
Going the way of Sun Microsystems.
It's very true. So
yeah.
Yep, Sun went that way. Silicon. What was it?
Silicon. Yeah, SGI,
graphics,
Silicon Graphics.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes, right. Like at the time that we covered these devices. So to come back to your point, so 2 points I'll make about that. Right? So firstly, Wired magazine had a cover in about 1998, just before Jobs came back. Might have been slightly earlier, and it just had it had the Apple the old Apple multicolor logo with the crown of thorns around it, and it just said "Pray."
I remember that.
By the way, they also said the web is dead, and
wow,
they're pretty good at getting things wrong.
Right.
So that's my first point. But my second point to it is that Apple reinvented itself and found a way to make that transition. But also a whole lot of Mac developers did too, right? And a lot, and I think if you're listening to this and you're not, like, I understand, like, that's why I brought this up. I understand the sense of maybe fear, anxiety, whatever you might think about. a future in which you've invested so much in a set of skills, right? I think they're really great foundations. But I think one of two things tends to happen to people. Like, people are often fearful, or they have, like a sense of incapacity around the deep, like JavaScript, deeper JavaScript. Oh my God, I'm not a programmer. And I would say to anyone who's really comfortable and competent with, with modern development using HTML, CSS, you have all the capability to do that. There are so many great resources to go and learn. And, if you're quite honest, as much as I advocate very much for a vanilla approach to learning vanilla CSS, JavaScript, HTML, it's clear in terms of hiring and in terms of, the work that you would potentially do with clients is that, the likes of React and Angular and Vue, which seems to really be getting great deal of momentum right now, are technologies that when we can come back to this question of like how much should we invest in a kind of that level of abstraction as opposed to the underlying level of abstraction. Right. But they're technologies that you can adapt pretty quickly. You can build some great stuff with that are in heavy demand. And if I had that set of skills, I would think about that as a transition step.
No, yeah, absolutely. I think that if you're going to be in the web development business, like, you need to learn some of these JavaScript front-end frameworks, which is a big leap for a lot of people, because there are a lot of people that do web development that, they're used to kind of using off-the-shelf jQuery or whatever, and they do a little bit here and there just to make things work. But to actually use a framework like React or Vue or whatever is a big leap for a lot of people, because they may or may not come from that computer science background. But and
I guess my point to this would be that we perceive it as a big leap, but people already have developed, like anybody we're talking about, anyone I'm talking to here who sort of listens to this and thinks this is me, right? Like, actually, it has the capability, because they're already doing that.
Yeah.
Right? But we kind of, to come back to that point of whether we consider HTML, CSS a bit of a toy or not real programming. The fact of the matter is, it is sophisticated and complex, and people have the capability, right? So it's really, what is the path? What is the next step? And I think, right now there are so many great resources. There are free courses. There's Coursera, and there's, other, finding that path, I don't think is particularly. There are a lot of pathways there.
But there is a lot of re-education that has to be done.
Sure, and I think people have to make that. I think that the time now is for people to acknowledge that this transition not only is going to happen, it probably already has happened. And if you see, I go back to the analogy. I remember the emergence of CSS, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in the late 90s, right? So I was kind of a very early adopter of CSS in 96, really before it was even fully standardized and particularly well supported. But I just, with my background and understanding publishing systems, a bunch of things, and hypertext, I kind of realized almost straight away how transformative it was going to be. Now, it took probably 8 years until very top flight productions, famously ESPN published, and there was a Wired magazine also did redesigns that heavily used CSS and modern standards and so on. But they didn't really emerge until 2003, 2004. So there was a kind of long period where CSS sort of slowly emerged. But prior to that, you had a bunch of people who had developed incredibly technical, complex skills around using tables and spacer gifs and a whole bunch of practices that most of the folks listening to this probably have never heard of, right?
Well, listen, I can sympathize with that completely, because there's a part of my brain that is filled with 68K assembly language, which, unless I'm doing embedded system stuff, it's completely useless. And the fact that I devoted all of that time to learning it, but one of my things is that I think it's, especially if you're in the technology business, but I think this applies kind of no matter what business you're in, that the skill that you need to learn is how to learn, because what you're going to be learning or doing is going to be changing pretty much constantly. So what you really need to do is try to figure out, how can I learn how to learn? And what that does is it makes it less troublesome when there is a new technology that comes up. You don't go, oh my God, I don't know this. This isn't the thing that I specialize in. I don't know how to do this. You have already learned how to learn. And John, I think you can kind of agree with me on this to some extent, or maybe you can't. I don't know. We'll see. But I think that once you've learned a programming language, yes, every language has different syntax, but once you kind of know how a programming language works, like learning another one is not that bad. It really isn't. And once you kind of get the idea of how a particular system works or an API works, when you're given something new, like let's say someone throws some new JavaScript framework in front of me, I just look at it as like yet another API to learn. But the knowledge of knowing how to digest an API and how to grok it and understand it and all that is something that I'm going to keep with me for a very long time. So I think learning how to learn, especially if you're in the tech business, is what you need to be doing, so that when the tech does shift, you don't throw your hands up and go, "Oh my God, like I'm going to go be a potato farmer somewhere," you know?
I think that's very true, and I think we've seen this. Anybody who's even doing this for 4 or 5 years, let alone 24 or 5 years, will have seen such profound transitions and changes. I think what's really important to also recognise is, and so to go back to this transition from all these people who knew to these complex things with tables and space gifts and the resistance they had, and often they would point out the shortcomings of CSS, right? And they were kind of right, but missing the point, right? And I think there's something that we ourselves have to resist, where we have to resist finding the reasons to not do things. The humans are naturally very conservative in some ways, but the constant of our industry will always be change. And so I think, if you face change and you look at what's changing in the industry and you find that all too hard and want to throw your hands up, I think that it probably isn't the place to be, right? Because it will just continue to do that. And so we have to develop, our approach to how we go about it. But also I think we have to kind of recognize the foundations that don't change as well. I think there are foundations in software engineering and in how we develop and design for the web that won't change, and you have them already. And so it's knowing what foundations to keep and what to add to them that is I think, really important.
Well, you know what I think is really interesting? When I look at all these JavaScript frameworks, and maybe Patrick or Earl kind of have an opinion on this as well, and I'd be interested to hear what anyone has to say, really. But I look at all of these various frameworks that are out there. Like you can use Vue, you can use React, you can use Preact, you can use this, you can use that, you can use the other thing. And who knows, what the framework is going to be next. But I look at this, and it does feel somewhat insane to me. Like it feels like at some point there should be a standard framework that comes with the browser. And now I fully realize that there are downsides to that, right? Because what you can do is you can stagnate from the point of view that if this is the only framework that people can use, that you're not going to have the kind of innovation that we're seeing with React and Vue and the like. However, it is kind of insane to me, coming from the background of someone who is used to an API that comes with the operating system, right? Like if I'm designing something for an iPhone, for instance, or Android, or whatever you want to pick, there isn't a menu of a dozen different APIs that I can use to build this thing, right? There's the one that is provided by the company that makes the device or platform, and that's what I end up using. And it does seem somewhat insane to me that every time I load a web page, I'm not just loading the web page, but I'm loading the application framework for every single page that I go to. So if we get to the point where every web page is an app, and they're a single page app, and some of them are using Vue, some are using React, some are using Preact, some are using whatever the next API framework is. It just seems insane to me that when I go to a web page, I'm not only downloading the code that someone wrote for this specific page, but I'm also downloading the whole framework for the page. I mean, it just seems insane to me.
Well, Andrew, I think you're missing that, like, a whole lot of jQuery snuck into JavaScript.
Right.
Yeah, that has definitely happened, and
That's
I expect that if Vue or whatever becomes really widespread, or that there will be a lot of really fancy caching that will start working its way into the browsers, and those things will start to be built in. I wanted to put in a word. I think that it's absolutely true that you say, oh, here's another JavaScript framework and another thing to program, and it's just another programming language. But I think that for the people who made that transition from, I'm really good at slicing things up into tables.
Right.
I'm really good at doing that in Photoshop. To then be thrown into, now I need to do this thing in CSS, which is much more like a programming language, and in those days, much more like a pretty terrible programming language.
Yeah.
That's not just, oh, you get to learn a new thing. And I think that for those people deciding that actually they'd rather go and be potato farmers is a totally reasonable career decision to make.
No, you're right, because it is a different skill set, right? And not even just CSS, Marion. Like, imagine there's a big segment of web developers that they look at stuff like Webpack or Gulp or Grunt or even the concept of like build systems in general, and they're like, oh my god, like, what is this crap?
Yeah, what's the matter with I was so happy with my FTP client that
right.
Didn't make me do it all in the command line.
But yeah, the list of things that you need to learn to do modern web development, like you need to know JavaScript, you need to know, at least some level of command line shell stuff. You need to learn a build system like Gulp or Grunt. You need to learn a code versioning system like Git. I mean, there's just a huge mess of things that you didn't used to have to learn. Earl, you were going to say something before. Did you want to chime in?
Well, I was just thinking about in terms of adoption of the JavaScript frameworks. That I imagine. I mean, I know it's off-putting for me to try and to decide on things like that, because what's the maintainability going to be? I mean, I know that we talked. I don't know. It's probably been more than a year. We talked about Grunt versus Gulp, and these things fall out of favor.
Right.
And then they become unmaintained, and if you're just jumping around from framework to framework, and you have legacy clients, that it's a lot to have to. It's not just like learning new tech, but it's constantly bouncing between them, and then things falling out of favor.
Right.
And,
it's a
lot. It's a lot to do.
For sure, and it's kind of like my wife loves that TV show Monk, and one of his lines is it's a blessing, or it's a curse and a blessing, or a blessing and a curse, or something like that. And I think that's the case with a lot of modern web development, is that it's a blessing that there is this kind of churn, because there's some amazing innovation that can happen, because there isn't one standards body that says you're going to do it this way for the JavaScript framework. And I think you get some amazing innovation because of that. But the curse, or the downside of that, is the tech churn is just absolutely off the charts. And I know a lot of people that just feel burnt out. Like there'll be a tweet about some awesome new JavaScript framework, and your reaction is not sweet, can't wait to check it out. Your reaction is like a facepalm and like, oh my god, another one.
Not another.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it really is.
I purposely hold back and just kind of wait and see if something is going to take hold and be adopted. A handful of weeks ago, everyone was into Parcel.js, and
right.
Then now I see that there are a lot of limitations to using that. I'm glad I didn't jump entirely into it. Not that it doesn't still look promising, but you can spend all day chasing the shiny thing. And even to your point about jQuery, there was a time where you had MooTools and YUI, and those are all kind of trying to see what would be the glue that makes JavaScript work well across browsers. And yeah, jQuery really came out on top. And for a long time, with CDNs, you can almost make the case that it's like everyone kind of has it cached, but maybe not quite.
But the cache won't always work, because people will have like different versions of it. And, so we really are downloading the whole, not just the app that someone wrote, but the framework that someone wrote to power the app. We're downloading that every time we visit a web page. But just to get to your point about how bad it is, like I am pretty new in terms of being into web development. I don't even know what the hell MooTools is, right? I mean, that is before my time. In terms of web development, I have no clue what that is, and that just shows you how quickly something that was widely used can become so obsolete that someone in the business doesn't even know what the hell it is. And that goes right to Earl's point. Like, Earl is probably like, well, maybe I should learn Vue, but if I invest all of that time in learning it, in 2 years, is it going to be gone?
Right.
You know, are people going to be on to, instead of Vue, they're going to be on to, you know, Scenic or whatever the next JavaScript thing is.
Right.
And what do you think about all that, John? I mean, you must hear this kind of angst from web developers attending your conference about the churn of this stuff. Like, it's off the charts.
Look, yes, I do. And so firstly, the way we've always approached this in our conferences, so we started our first conference in 2004, and I think our first one didn't have any JavaScript-related content. Because it was just really almost not easy. You know, like I think jQuery came out in around the same time as we did our first conference. And prior to that, if you did anything, you added a little bit of functionality with JavaScript. Everyone rolled their own little bits and bobs. You know, it was the kind of Ajax revolution around 2005 that probably really started driving this. It's a term no one ever uses anymore, but and probably a lot of people hardly ever heard it. Right? But sort of kind of, you know, around the same time that jQuery emerged and became ultimately the dominant framework. But we've always been quite insistent in our conferences to never focus at that level of the abstraction. Right? So I think we had one session once, which was a shootout between kind of a whole range of different competing frameworks and so on, like jQuery.
Oh my God, nerd fight.
Probably. It was a bit, including one person who advocated for not using frameworks, and that was that was kind of many years ago now. Look, I think it is. I think it's something that is going to continue in our industry. I think, as Marion alluded to, a lot of the experimentation that gets reabsorbed into the DOM and into our programming languages, like certainly JavaScript, hopefully, you know, CSS has been influenced, particularly with the likes of Sass, right, with variables and so on. To try to I see happening a lot is innovation in this space that then gets reabsorbed into the core of the platform.
Right.
And so having the likes of JavaScript to allow us to to do some of the things in our to move things like the query selector and so on into JavaScript and away from jQuery, it kind of allowed people to move, a long way away from that. So
yeah, and that's a really good point.
I think it's a cycle of innovation that we kind of see. So I don't think the cycle is going to go away. I think we have to develop our own personal approaches to how we kind of cope with it. Right? I think the maintainability point that Earl made is a really strong one, and I think that's something in software engineering that has long been considered very important. On the web, I think traditionally less likely to be so. We've sort of built to throw away a lot more on the web traditionally.
But I really think no matter what,
it's a good thing. I'm just alluding to.
Well, I think no matter what your app is, there is definitely something to be said for throwing everything out and doing it over again. Because software engineering is really strange, because it's one of those things that you don't figure out how to build something right until after you've built it a lot of the time. Like, that's just a thing. So you can take a lot of the experience that you've gained from building that thing, and instead of continuing to tack stuff onto it, tech debt style, at some point, there's a tipping point where it's way better for you to just burn the house down and start over again with everything that you've learned. And you'll end up building something better.
That's true, although there are many cases of where that's basically killed off products and platforms and stuff.
True.
So Joel Spolsky wrote about this extensively a number of years, probably over a decade ago now. So Joel on software, Joel, kind of behind Trello and Stack Overflow and a whole bunch of other things. He wrote about this, and it is the siren call. It's all too late. We've got so much tech debt. We've got to start all over again. But it generally is often where products just collapse in a heap, and the transition is so long, feature compatibility and so on. So, and I think on the web we're just starting to reach the stage where we're realizing the importance of maintainability over multi-year, how many products out there, how many major platforms, the things that so much of our society relies on are actually built, the code base is a decade old. I think there'd be very little, right? Like what I mean is the stuff that runs in browsers, right? As opposed to operating systems, where some of the core of those technologies go back decades.
Oh, see, where I thought you were going to take this, John, was that that people would be scared at how gnarly some of the underpinnings of the services that we depend on are. And it's definitely true, because like I've got a number of friends of mine that work at Apple, and there's one guy that doesn't work there anymore, but there was a certain generation of MacBook Pro that they needed to ship the thing, but it didn't meet certain heat tolerances for when it was on your lap. Like it didn't meet those heat tolerances, so they couldn't ship it. The solution was they put a sticker on the damn thing. They put a sticker on it, and it reduced the amount of heat that came out of it just enough that they could ship it. And there are other instances of that. Like if anyone remembers, Apple at one point had an entry into the business market where they had this thing called an Xserve RAID, right? Which was like Apple's RAID array thing. And they had an issue where the thing wouldn't, like everything worked fine. It was tested. It was ready to go after it was announced. And then they turned developer mode off and the thing wouldn't boot. Like there was some kind of race condition that when they actually put it in production mode, it would not boot. So what did they do? What do you think they did, John?
Ran it in developer mode.
They shipped it in with development mode on. Absolutely, that's what they did.
I'm not quite sure you want to be running your servers in developer mode, right?
Well, this was just the boot process.
Right.
This was just the boot process. But I think, I thought that's where you're going with it. But I think it's very true. Like if people knew, kind of the under the hood, everyone looks at their code and they're like, oh, maybe it's not that great. But there's lots of code that's powering everything that is not that great, like everywhere.
I think that's very, very true. Yeah. But the question is, does code get better by chucking out and starting again, or does the code get better by over time paying attention and refining it? And then there's a whole bunch of challenges, and I hear it all the time from people building systems who if they got a couple of weeks to fix a whole bunch of things around performance, their performance increased dramatically, but the budget is coming from marketing people who are like, what do you mean? You're going to spend all this time and money and nothing new is going to happen? We're not getting a new feature out of it. So I think a part of the challenge we have is that we're kind of obsessed, and it's not just our own obsessions, but I guess the role that the web has traditionally played more in the marketing communications world than necessarily IT software world,
right.
That emphasizes features and novelty over foundations and performance and security. And I think that's an interesting transition that we're going through, is where the web sits as a technology within organizations, right? Who owns it? And as I said, like traditionally it has been considered marketing communications. It's been very campaign driven. Like, and I think it's why we have a lot of short-term code bases is, we're not building traditionally products, we're building campaigns, right? So we build a thing and it launches and it just sits there and it does its job. And whether it's a short-term job or a medium-term job or a long-term job, it's essentially kind of done when it's shit. And moving to a kind of product mindset and moving to, also, I guess, the role that web-based content is playing is increasingly sophisticated, business critical, maybe the only touch point or a critical touch point.
Well, that actually plays off of
organizations. Right?
That actually plays off of something that I've been saying for a while, and I really do think it's true that there are a lot of agencies and independent freelancers or whatever that kind of back their way into doing web development. Like, maybe the agency originally did magazine and video advertising, and now, that the web is a thing, they kind of back their way into it. And a lot of these people don't understand that they are doing software development. And and it's different than designing a brochure. It really is a very different thing. And I think there are a lot of again, agencies that don't realize that they are software developers. Like they never thought they were, they never intended to be, but they have become software developers by virtue of what they're doing. And they really need to have some of the practices that quote unquote real software development has. But, we're getting kind of near the end of this, and I just wanted to put you on the spot, John. And I want your prediction. When we sit down and we do this interview in 10 years discussing the web, what is it going to be? Like, what has changed? Will the web even exist? 10 years.
So if we're so one thing I've spoken a bit about recently is I kind of feel we're running into the limitations of a paradigm of computing as a human experience that we've had for the last 40 years. And let's call that the kind of personal computer, right? So what characterizes personal computers, and in many respects, I think it's fair to call this last 40 years a single paradigm, even though it might look profoundly different if you go back to the Apple I and those very early computers that we used to call microcomputers, and we ultimately kind of became the personal computer. Like that looks very different to my iPhone 10, right?
Right.
I don't have an iPhone 10, by the way, but like it looks very different to the iPhone 10. And yet, if you think about what characterizes all of that period of computing, is they're screen-based, they're largely text-based, and they're based on reading and writing text for the most part. Or, we introduced some things like direct manipulation of objects like buttons, or, like someone initially with pointer devices like mouses, and then with our fingers. But if you think about what has happened over that period, so what changes have happened over the time? Well, we come from for 20 odd years, or the first half or more of that, actually the first 3/4 of that period, we were stuck in rooms, right? We had no wireless, so we were stuck in rooms, plugged into power, plugged into networks. Once networks became a thing, right? It's only really, then suddenly we kind of had laptops, kind of maybe almost 20 years ago, a little bit less, where we could kind of take them somewhere and they didn't need power for a while. And then once you have Wi-Fi, you could take them a bit more. You could take them to places where they didn't need to be plugged in quite so much. There's a bit more portability. A decade or so ago, we got the smartphone, obviously iPhone and then Android, and that allowed us to start taking our devices more and more places, right?
Yeah, a lot of people don't even have computers. They do everything on their phone. Yeah.
Right. And we can take them to places like bars or restaurants or family gatherings. We take them into our car. We can use them walking down the street.
And the number of embarrassing photos skyrocketed.
Right. But the challenge is that we're now taking computing into places it doesn't really work anymore. Like it interferes with the way in which humans have socialized and evolved over long periods of time, right? By sitting in a room full of people and pulling your phone out instead of sitting around having a cup of tea together or having a meal together or whatever it happens to be, you end up with a very different kind of dynamic that often doesn't work. If you get in your car, and I heard yesterday that I believe the state of Georgia in the United States, the number of road fatalities has increased by 30% in recent years, that they attribute largely to distracted driving because of devices. Right?
Sure.
We're sort of, I guess, I think we're reaching the outer limits of a screen-based direct manipulation kind of approach to computing. And one of the reasons why is that it relies on our frontal cortex and our visual cortex, which essentially are not well adapted to reading and writing text or those sorts of things. And as a consequence, essentially, they completely flood our brain, right? Our brain doesn't multitask when it comes to the visual cortex, particularly reading and writing. But I'm sitting here with a pair of earphones in that at the moment I feel like a kind of prototype of what computing interfaces might begin to increasingly look like over the next decade.
So you're thinking something that is more omnipresent but requires less of your attention.
I think that's a very good way of characterizing it. So it can be there and listening all the time and giving me feedback all the time.
Right.
But humans are pretty good at multitasking when they listen. And there are a bunch of concerns, there are a bunch of challenges, without a doubt, that I see. But if something can essentially augment me when I'm out and about, when I, in a way that doesn't interfere with my driving a car or even potentially our conversations, right? It can whisper something into my ear. It can kind of, in the same way that my subconscious might whisper an idea as we're talking, and that reminds me of a thing, right? I'm not saying that screen-based paradigms, I'm not saying the phones and the devices that we use are going away, because if you actually look at the history of computing, new paradigms of computing, whether it's a phone, desktop, laptop, whatever, they never replace even our uses of those existing devices don't tend to go down, right?
And it never happens as quickly as we think, right? Because if we look at a lot of the prediction, we all should be in like flying cars right? You know, I mean,
Right.
that's the thing
Right.
that should be happening. Yeah.
But what the science fiction of the 50s and 60s that promised us flying cars largely didn't talk about was globally connected networks that gave you access at almost no cost to almost all of human knowledge.
So you're thinking about a device that I might have with me. Maybe it's my phone. Maybe, you know, it takes a different shape. But it might be listening to my conversation. I'd be like, oh, you know, what is that? You know, whatever, and it will just kind of whisper in my ear with the answer. Is kind of the paradigm that you're looking at.
I think that it will be a mode of interaction that I think once we've reached, and I think we have largely reached the limits of this kind of current mode of visual-based direct manipulation of objects and very text and reading-based. Yes, I think so, and I think two things are happening right now. It's the miniaturization of microphones and you know, earpieces and so on, such that, you know, these prototypes, the AirPod and you know, Google Buds and various other devices. You can only imagine what Moore's law will say about them. I mean, at the moment, tens of thousands of people a year get cochlear implants to allow them to hear better. Right?
Yeah.
Now, Major League Baseballers in the US get LASIK eye surgery, and in fact, it's almost impossible to be a top flight batter in Major League Baseball.
I had that done in 1999. I had LASIK done.
Well, and so what you're seeing is MLB, you know,
terrible at baseball though, by the way.
Right. It's necessary but not sufficient to be a good baseball.
Yeah.
So humans are doing these kind of technical modifications of our body to improve our capabilities, and we have been for long. You know, it's been specialized in the case of, say, sports people for a long time. But I think there are all sorts of directions that this.
Well, where does the web fit into it though? Does it become just an information pool, a place where information gets put, and you know, somehow this device can kind of tap into it? I mean, do you think in 10 years anyone's going to be banging out HTML? Do you think that's going to be a thing?
Well, I, at the end of the day, this content is going to have to be distributed,
right?
And I think what's really interesting is that text will continue to be essentially the kind of interoperability. So what I think we're going to see, and what's going to kind of bring this about in no small part, is the rise of really good speech to text, text to speech, natural language processing,
translation,
and translation. Right?
Yeah.
So we're already seeing examples of this. You know, you can prototype the Babel fish in an afternoon using, you know, any number of APIs from IBM, from Amazon, from Google. You know, like we've got
with hilariously bad results in some cases, unfortunately.
That's true, but that over time, the improvement is astonishing. Speech to text is getting astonishingly accurate. When I was in the US recently, I would sit in a number of from time to time you sit in a bar, you're having a conversation. Sports seems to be ubiquitous in bars in the US, and they will have captioning on, and it was clear to me that captioning could not have been human.
Right.
Because it was too quick, and yet it was extremely accurate. Right. So we're sort of seeing these applications in all sorts of places that we're not even aware of right now. And if you extrapolate out in terms of computing power, in terms of how much better, like certainly if you look in the research labs and you're seeing the accuracy, even of conversations between people like ourselves right now with different accents and so on. Basically, we're quicker and better in labs now than humans are. Like the best in all, not as good at capturing questions as AI kind of is now. In certainly in places like some of the labs at Microsoft and so on. And it will only, I think, those sort of technologies only take a small number of years now to permeate everywhere. And so so where's web in this? I think the important part about this is that the web, and its great strength has always been that it has essentially worked everywhere. It's reached everywhere, and it's connected to everything, right? And the alternative is a single stack, a single technology stack owned and controlled by a single vendor. And I think, like within certain very narrow confines, that may or may not happen. But I think as we permeate computation in more and more places, the idea that it will all run within a single technology stack controlled by a single vendor is just no longer really, I don't think it's made sense for a long time. I think it makes sense in the context of traditional applications. I just don't think it makes sense in the context of this highly distributed kind of approach to functionality.
So, John, you reminded me of a bit of trivia that I'm going to see.
Right.
You probably know this, but I didn't know it when I figured it out. But do you know, like you've seen those news programs, and you mentioned one where there's text that scrolls along the bottom with the headlines and stuff. Do you know what those are called? Does anyone know what those are called?
Oh, I forget now, but I know a lot of them are SVG.
But do you know the name for that scrolling thing? Does anyone know?
It's either the marquee or the crawl, I would say.
Ticker tape?
Ticker sometimes.
But
it's actually called a chiron.
A chiron.
Chiron. Is it chiron? Okay.
It's chiron.
Whatever it is. Whatever.
The chiron's just the big bold. It's not the.
But the reason it's called that is that's the name of the company that invented the tech that did the first scroll, and it became like a term like Xerox, or whatever. Well, listen, John, this has been fantastic. I would love to have you on again here, because I think that we could talk about the future of tech, and it would be really fun to like put this in a time capsule and really come back in 10 years and be like,
oh, absolutely.
How right were we about any of this crap? But I think that about wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm podcast. To have every episode delivered to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our RSS feed or subscribe via iTunes or Google Play. And if you like what we're doing, leave us a review. You can follow us on Twitter at devMode.fm, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Just leave us a comment on the devMode.fm website. For the devMode FM podcast, I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Earl Johnston.
I'm Patrick Harrington.
Marion Nilevant.
And our special guest, John Allsopp. Thanks for coming on, man. This was amazing.
I had a great time. Thanks so much. And I look forward to being back in 10 years' time.
Yeah, we're going to have you back in 10 years' time and see how well you did. All right, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.